Hello guys and welcome to an MSPaint Storytime brought to you by Camo Crusader. Today we're going to be talking about working at a meat factory. Okay, so I know the first question you're going to ask is, Camo, what do you mean by working at a meat factory? And what I mean by that is taking meat and turning it into meal. And we'll get further on that here in a second. So I know the first thing that you need to make meal is meat, right? But where does the meat come from? It comes from barns, comes from farms, comes from trash cans, comes from leftover food, comes from dead roaches, comes from opossums that jump in the pit. You got dead rats and stuff that jump in there. Everything, people, who knows? And where it all goes is what I can only describe as a gore pit. Okay, so the gore pit is, as you can imagine, a pit full of gore. It's just meat from all sorts of animals, all sorts of like leftover trash food from restaurants and butchers and stuff, and it's just thrown in a big hole. And in the bottom of those holes, it has augers or screws. So what an auger or screw is it's a mechanical screw, kind of if you think what you build with, and it pushes materials in a certain direction. Well, this pushes it from the sides of the pit into the middle of the pit, and then from the middle of the pit it's pushed upwards out of the pit. Next step in the process is what I'm calling the aftermath of the gore pit. Is once the augers lift the meat out of the gore pit, it is then dropped into a crusher, which is if you picture it in your mind, the trash compactor from Star Wars when they were on the Death Star, and it's just those big kind of like metal plates that's just clamping together. That's what it does to the meat, and it just breaks all the bones and the meat and the intestines and everything up and grinds it up into like a fine, no, not really fine, just more of like loose guts and stuff, and where you don't really have just the whole carcass, because sometimes it could be like entire cow carcasses or entire pig carcasses and stuff like that. So you just have that all ground up. After the crusher, it's then moved by another auger to what's called the cooker, which is basically a gigantic deep fryer. Alright, so the next step of the process is actually cooking the meat, right? Because it's all been raw so far. Just dumped into a giant pit and then crushed up and dropped in a cooker. So after it's been dropped into the cooker, there's other stuff added to it, like blood, or, and yes, I mean like actual blood from the carcasses up top. You've got sludge, which is basically a mix between blood, grease, and just general crustiness made into a black sludge that's poured in there as well, in very small amounts. Also, you have grease, like any kind of fryer. The grease, you have to have grease in it first for the fryer to actually cook. So you have to fill it up with grease, drop the meat in, and basically what happens is the whole temperature of the cooker is kind of regulated by this sludge and blood combo. Alright, the next step in the process is to have the proto meal, I'm going to call it, that comes out of the cooker is then pushed along on another auger that brings it to the press, or the presses. Sometimes there's just one, sometimes there's two. But what it does at the press is, if you imagine in your mind kind of like a lemon press or a lemon squeezer, where you're taking basically this greasy, moppy, what you can imagine as like the crustiness left over in the bottom of a fryer after you get done frying some chicken or something. That is then squeezed so that all of the grease comes out of it, and then it comes out as like a fine powder that kind of looks like dirt, like greasy dirt, which then brings it over to the sifter. Alright, so I can hear you scratching your head, right? And you're like, but Camo, you said that this was a video about working in the meat factory, not how the meat factory works. Well, let me tell you one thing. To understand how to work somewhere, you have to understand how the work is done, right? Basically, just to give you the lowdown on what it's like working at a meat factory, is it's not a lot of physical labor. It's mostly just having to constantly fight with the urge to vomit everywhere, because it smells like rancid, musty, old, crusty meat that's been decomposing in a big giant pit, and then from the pit, it's then wheeled across the entire factory on these augers that then drops it into like a gigantic cooker that's cooking it at like 300 degrees. And if you're like me and you had to operate the cooker, then you're in there with the stink. And not only are you dealing with the stink, but you're also dealing with a 300-degree room that you're stuck in there with. and the only thing you have keeping you cool is a crusty old 50-year-old fan that's got 2 inches of layered dust on it, spraying it right into your face. So, I mean, it's not really kind of my favorite job that I've ever had in the past, but it made good money at the time, so it was kind of worth it. Alright, so the next and final part of the whole system is you have the sifter, where we left off on the last part, that then uses an auger to bring it up and drop it on the floor in big piles. And like, it's literally in a room of the factory in just gigantic piles on the floor. So, you know, you've went through all this work making all this, and it's dumped right into the floor, right? Well, after it's dumped into the floor, you'll have a truck come along. Truck will back into a bay that has augers up in the ceiling that drop it into the back of the truck, and you fill the truck up. It's then exported out of the factory. Alright, so we've been through this whole process, and you might be wondering, Camo, what is all this actually used for? What is this meal used for? Well, it's specifically for animal consumption, because after hearing what you've heard me tell you about today, you've probably decided that you would never want to eat this ever in your life. And it's mostly used in chicken feed, pig feed, cow feed, cat food, dog food, pretty much any kind of feed that you would feed your animals that you would not eat yourself, which eventually ends up helping the animals grow and, you know, produce offspring, which then in the circle of life kind of situation, they end back up in the meat pit at some point in time. So if you think about it, it's kind of like a eternal life of meat pit, gore pit, animal feed, making animal baby, and then returning to the pit from whence came. So that's basically it. Alright, I thank you guys for watching, and this was really good for me to come back to YouTube. This has been my first actual video since my long hiatus after the past couple years, and this has been my first ever attempt at a video like this. So if you liked it, leave a like, leave a comment, tell me how well or bad I did. If it was absolute trash, don't mind telling me. Like I said, I've never tried anything like this before, so this was a perfect first try. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.